Hello, folks. It's Ted. I'm back. Today, following along with more topical kinds of streams, um, I want to talk about this article that I found. I really like it. Um, it's by another guy that's in the handmade community, guy by the name of Karl Zylinski. He actually is, unlike myself, he's actually a professional game developer. um, he actually worked in the game industry, and he actually worked on game engine tools, as you will soon find out in this article here, which I'm going to read on stream. So Carl is perhaps now known most recently for his game Cat and Onion on Steam, a very cute kind of platformer sort of game, which he developed entirely from scratch, actually. So he built the game itself and the quote unquote engine himself. He used Odin and Raylib to do that. And he used a process of prototyping that's actually very similar to what I do. And so that's kind of why this article caught my attention or sort of popped into my radar was, hey, like here's kind of another person that's sort of doing something similar to what I'm doing. And what I wanted to do was just read this article and sort of point out the similarities or maybe I had a few thoughts about it, just a few comments on what's here and kind of what his process is. So with no further ado, we are going to read Solo Devs and the Trap of the Game Engine. So you can find this on his blog, zylinski.se/posts. So since I was 19, I've wanted to make my own video games, as in creating everything in the game myself, often referred to as being a solo developer or solo dev. But I was bad at committing to anything, and I always thought that I lacked some specific skill, such as music making, game design skills, and art skills. Now I'm 35 and just released my own game, see trailer below. I've made everything in it myself. Okay, so I would say my story is maybe a little bit different. When I was younger, I did want to make games. I think I was interested in it, but oddly, I think when I was a teenager, actually, when I was in high school, I we had some kind of like senior project, and my senior project I actually did. I made a game, but it was like with RPG Maker, and so it's like, what did I know about developing games, right? I had like no exposure to anything good, right? Like I didn't know anybody that developed games, and if I went and looked for it, it'd be like, oh, download RPG Maker and like make something with it. And so I made this like kind of hey, how's it going? I made this kind of like crappy RPG with RPG Maker, and I thought that was making a game, right? If I had, this is kind of this is sort of my optimistic message for like new game developers. What I would say is it certainly seems like the ecosystem is just like crowded with a bunch of crap that's out there, and like it's overly complex, and and it's really easy to get very negative about how things are with game development. But actually, what I would like to just stop and say is like, hey, like the educational environment right now is actually much, much better in certain respects than when I was a kid, right? There's actually more good resources out there than when I was a kid, and there's better ways of like finding those resources. Now, we do have this other problem where I would say the educational resources, the good stuff doesn't necessarily bubble to the surface, right? Because it's not always popular, and the people that are making the good stuff, because they're smart, they don't really like to play this kind of clickbait game. And so if they do ever accidentally happen to like have something take off that gets viral, say like, a person I'm thinking of is of course Casey Muratori in Handmade Hero, right? Most of Handmade Hero never is, it's not going to be at the top of Google for like, years and years on end. But there's a handful of things that he has made which because they trigger people in some way, or because they're very polarizing type content that does, bubble all the way up to the surface. So, that video about, clean code, or horrible performance, right? That thing just kind of, so occasionally he will have something that like bubbles to the surface. But the point is like, hey, Casey is making really good content and he is actually showing people how to make games from scratch. And there's a lot of valuable information that new game programmers can go and look at today that when I was a kid, I never had access to any of that stuff. Like I'm 41 now. So it took me until age 40 to release my first full game. But I think a kid nowadays that just has like the internet and YouTube, who had like a genuine aim to make something good and to really understand what they're doing, they've got so much more at their disposal now than when I was a kid. So I think that's great. Continuing. What happened in the time between 19 and 35, and what stopped me from making my own game? Well, lots of things happened. I went to university. I got a job in the games industry, engine tools programmer. I worked at several game companies. I got burnt out, studied astrophysics, then back to games again, and then finally I ended up trying to make a game by myself and actually managed to finish it. Yeah, and I've got sort of another, similar kind of like winding path. I didn't I kind thinking back on it, I probably should have been much more focused. But like I went to school, I studied philosophy for like 2 years, and then I kind of decided that philosophy was basically just a bunch of word games and wasn't really doing much like substantively, or it just felt like a lot of kind of like silly semantic games to me. So I kind of stopped doing that. And then I started studying computer science and I studied physics and I studied a bunch of just hard science courses in college. And then I graduated and I just, for whatever reason, I was like in my 20s, I wanted to go and experience something that wasn't just sitting inside at a desk. And so I spent my 20s living as a snowboard bum out in the mountains of Colorado, and I just did that as much as I possibly could, and I was trying to achieve things in snowboarding. I wanted to see like exactly how good I could get at it, like so I got all the way up to where I was hitting the biggest jumps and doing like double flips off of them, and then I kind of hit that point where I was like, I don't know how much more I can do in snowboarding that isn't going to hurt myself, isn't going to hurt my friends and family, right? And I eventually had to decide, and also it's a huge distraction from like these other pursuits, right? That would eventually could do, like I don't have a career in snowboarding, obviously. Like I was just doing it because I wanted to like test myself in some way. I knew I would never have a career in it, but at that point I kind of had this realization where it was like, I need to do something more serious with my life. I need to have more of a real skill. I need to make, some real products, or I need to do something that I can actually make money with. And that's kind of how I got back into software. So I think a lot of us actually go through these kind of like winding paths. I'm just pretty straight up and honest about it. Was it a good thing? Was it a bad thing? I'm not really sure. I mean, I think there's a lot of ways you could look at what I did in my 20s and say that was just a total waste of time, and you'd probably be right, but I guess you can't really regret those things, and I feel pretty accomplished for having done it. Like I had a good time, and I guess maybe I learned a lot of things about myself. I don't know, just trying to put a positive spin on it. Anyway, the funny thing is, my approach to making games at 35 is more similar to the one I had around age 19 than the approach I learned from working in the games industry. Interesting. So the approach when I was around 19. When I was somewhere between 19 and 22, I used to make games using C++ and the library known as SFML. I've never heard of it. This just meant creating a C++ program that used SFML to open a window, check for some input, and draw some graphics. There was no big game engine, just a C++ program that used SFML in a very ad hoc way to get things done. At the time, I never actually finished any game using this method other than some group projects in school. But some of my prototypes got pretty far. Okay, cool. So, he's kind of just playing around with programming, and what I like about this is he's really talking about what it's like to be kind of young and naive and sort of without any preconceptions of how you're supposed to do things, right? And I think one of the things that happens to a lot of us as we age and as we have more experience, we're exposed to things, we're exposed to more that kind of like crustifies or like hardens our beliefs about how we're supposed to do things. And so it is refreshing, and I think something that one should attempt to at least try to do every now and then is to almost pretend that you're stupid. Almost pretend that you don't actually know anything about how to do stuff, because like trying to enter that like presuppositionless state, right? You'll have new insights. So I think there's something valuable in that. Okay, getting a job in the games industry. Around age 23, I got a job as a game engine tools programmer. I worked with some very talented people on the BitSquid game engine. It's discontinued, but still used for creating games such as Helldivers 2. My job was to create editors for the engine, such as level editors, etc. I also got a lot of good insight into the C++ code base of the engine. Naturally, I adopted lots of the mindsets of how to make games from this job. For example, I started thinking that before you make a game, you need to have a nice, shiny engine in place with good tools. Okay, now that's interesting. I mean, that's kind of that saying, be careful about the ideas that you're exposed to because they can, in some sense, be harmful to you, where things went a bit wrong. It is very easy to look at a general purpose game engine such as BitSquid, Unity, or Godot and think that you should use such engines with such tools to create games. I still wanted to create my own games, as in solo developing them, so in my spare time I was tinkering away. But I got way too inspired by my day job. I was creating renderers, abstract level editing tools, file formats, data compilers, but I didn't write any gameplay code at all. That, I thought, came when the engine was mature enough. So I think that, I was actually talking about this yesterday. I was talking about all these different ways that we can kind of procrastinate on just making the game, right? Yesterday I was talking about, you can procrastinate, or not yesterday, the day before. You can procrastinate by saying, oh, my artist hasn't come back with enough artwork, right? And once I get the artwork, then I can make the game. Well, if you always come up with an excuse, then you're never going to do it. So, really the mindset you want to have when prototyping a game is to just be doing gameplay code, going straight to that and focusing on that and really nothing else. So, using third-party game engines. In my 20s, I did lots of game jams, and I made many of them with Unity. It was usually a quite enjoyable process. But whenever I tried to take those games beyond the game jam/prototype stage, it just stopped being fun. Engines like Unity are data heavy in the sense that you create some stuff in the editor and then hook those things up with some code. It's a jumble where you jump back and forth between editors and code. Having those kinds of tools are good for empowering non-technical game designers to create games. But for a designer/programmer who tries to make a game by themselves, this split mostly introduces friction and, at least for me, makes the creation of games less fun. Yeah, I actually find this paragraph to be one of the most interesting ones in this article because it's interesting, like what, the reasons that people always have different reasons. If somebody goes into say, making a game from scratch, right? Or trying to do it, the simple way, there's a lot of different reasons. Some people, they assume that we didn't try the game engines, right? It's like, so when I go and I say I didn't use Unity, it's like, what did did you not try it? And it's like, well, actually, I did try it, and I tried it, and I didn't like it, and I thought that it was kind of, I had this like weird feeling like it was getting in my way in a lot of senses. And I think the reason that I felt that it was getting in my way was I because of my programming background, because of the computer science classes I took in college, I kind of had this intuition about how the computer has to work. And so I was always asking these questions like, hey, like, what's this doing with memory? What's that doing? Um, oh, like, I think one of the things I remember when using Unity was I wanted to just do some really simple, like, sprite animations, like just some frame-based animations, like, or keyframe-based animations. And I had to go through this, like, really complicated, like, state machine thing that Unity had. And I was just like, okay, but like all I want is for like on this frame we're gonna like increment the index for the for the animation that we're gonna show, and like that's how we could do animations. But I just remember having to like go through this kind of big bulky complex setup just in order to do something that seemed pretty simple, and that really felt like the case for the whole thing. So much of what I had to do, it's like I'm waiting on some like event from an object, and like I don't really have any sense of like the order in which things get called, you know. So I think and this is kind of where the split comes in, right? Like if you're non-technical, right? So like let's say you're coming into this with like very little knowledge of computer science, right? You would just think this is okay. You would just be like, yeah, whatever. I'm going to set up the state machine, and like, it wouldn't necessarily occur to you as big and bulky and not really necessary. But I think if you do have that computer science background, you're probably going to feel like this is just not a satisfying way to make games. Okay, so I'm going to read a comment. Maybe you can relate, but I have a limited tolerance for magic and code. So the reason I didn't like game engines is because it felt like learning how to use a complex engine was the same as learning the essentials I'd need. Yeah, and I think that's a similar experience. And then like to add kind of more weight to that argument of yours, right? Because your argument is basically like it's a similar argument I've made a lot, is like you're gonna suffer anyway, right? But the thing is that you get to choose how you suffer, right? So you're gonna suffer learning Unity, or you're gonna suffer learning how to actually, you're gonna suffer learning a more deep and more fundamental skill, which is like simple procedural programming, like C-style programming, right? So you're gonna suffer either way. Why not? If you're going to put the time in, if you're going to have to invest, if you're going to have to learn this stuff, why don't you learn the thing that's more fundamental that would then enable you to really make anything that you want, instead of learning this other thing like Unity, which is just going to be like a bunch of trivia, right? It's just going to be a bunch of like, oh, if I click this checkbox, then like the thing will do the thing that I want, and oh crap, like they updated Unity now, and now like it's a different checkbox. And there, to me, is something very not satisfying about tethering my knowledge to this third-party thing that is totally magical, total black box, and somebody else is in control of it. They get to decide what knowledge I need to have, and then all this knowledge that I spent accumulating, suffering for, it just gets wiped out because like maybe their company goes defunct, right? Which could happen, almost happened last year. Or, they put out some new update, or they decide like, some other new like programming ideology is going to take over, and now we're doing that. And so we got to relearn everything. So, okay, another comment. Also, another thing is that I know myself really well. So when I came to the realization that I don't care about finishing a game, but I care about learning useful code / stuff, my intention changed a lot and my motivation increased. Oh, that's kind of interesting. Yeah, so like using the game kind of as a way to learn something useful and new. And I would say if you were a student, like if you were younger, I'm thinking about somebody like my nephew's age. My nephew's like 10, so pretty soon he'll be old enough to like actually learn how to like program things. Um, it would be so much more valuable if he learned something like C than learned something like Godot, because with C, even if he never finishes whatever game or project he's working on, he will at least have like a building block, like a base knowledge that he can then go and apply to pretty much any programming task or job that's out there, right? So I'm going to take a sip and then continue. Odin plus Raylib, back to basics. A few years ago, I ended up trying the Odin programming language along with Raylib. Raylib is a library similar to SFML but written in C. Odin comes with built-in bindings for Raylib. When I played around with this combo, I had a flashback. This feels like the good fun days when I made games using C++ and SFML. Not because of any similarity between the languages and libraries, but because my game was just a program that used a lib to show some graphics. Okay, wow. So, a few things. I met Ginger Bill a few years ago. Great guy. I also met the guy that made Raylib. I met them at Handmade Con. Probably, this dates me, probably like 4 years ago. It was a while ago because I don't really go to conferences much lately. I'm too busy. Both great people with like a genuinely good aim, right? They're genuinely trying to do something good for the programming community. But then also, like, if I went and read the Odin documentation, and I just found myself like agreeing a lot, actually, with so much that's in there. And I've always kind of been on the fence in terms of wanting to switch everything that I do over to Odin because I agree so much with what it does. But then, at least for me personally, since I've invested so much in my like present tool set, it would be a big lift to do that. So I just haven't done it yet. But to somebody that's totally new to this, right? One of the things I could definitely recommend that would be probably more immediately gratifying or satisfying would be just trying out Odin plus Raylib. You know, you're not necessarily going to get full exposure to like the graphics APIs as you would if you did something like what I did, where I did like the whole programming, the whole like platform layers in like Metal on Mac OS and like Direct3D 11 on Windows and all that stuff. But you can make full games. Like Odin is a serious programming language. It is used in serious tools. Jenga FX uses it to do these amazing like fire simulations and water simulations, and actually like they are a profitable company. Like I have a bias in any tool that I use, really. I have a bias towards tools which are used in companies that make products that face real customers. So I'm much less likely to want to use a language if it isn't in some way being used in production for some business that actually makes money, And I'm not going to name names or anything like that, but I think there's a lot of programming languages and tools that are not coming from a product-oriented mindset. They're coming from a programming-oriented mindset. Or, in worst cases, they're coming from kind of like with Rust, I think they're just coming from a purely like ideological mindset. It's like we have this ideology about what memory safety is, and we want to enforce that ideology across the industry, right? And I especially am wary of using any of those tools because these people they're not making products, right? Like they're not in the trenches. They're not dealing with customers. They don't have to like pay rent. Okay, fair, right. Okay, no, right. There's probably some comparisons I'm not making that are there's probably a bunch of ways that I'm wrong in my assessment. And if it is true that it is genuinely being used in a business and they're finding a lot of value out of it, then that's great. But that kind of ideological stuff really rubs me the wrong way. It's one of the reasons I like Odin, and one of the reasons I like Jai as well, is they both come from people who have to put products in front of customers. And they're not just simple products. They're complicated products like, John's new Sokoban game, right? They're like very, difficult products to pull off. So anyway, I'll continue. I could quickly get some stuff to display on the screen, but in contrast to using a third-party game engine, I could put as much stuff in code as I wanted. There was no dependency on data created within game engine tools. No dependency on data created within game engine tools. To me, that's always been another kind of like perk with doing it from scratch yourself. Is like you have total control over the file formats for different things that you make. So like let's say that like when I did Moose Solutions, right? This puzzle game that I made a few months back, or that I released a few months back, took me years. Every level actually I came up with a custom file format for the puzzles, but and that file format was totally under my control, right? It wasn't something that, like, if I did that game in Unity, then all the levels would have been a Unity scene or something like that. And that's kind of this like opaque file format that I don't necessarily know what everything is in it. And I don't necessarily, maybe some people could dig through the scenes, but also by necessity, that file format is going to be much more complex. It's going to have a bunch of stuff in it that isn't like directly related to your game. That's more like related to Unity and all of the kinds of game engine features that Unity has to support, right? Versus when I did the file format or the puzzle save file or whatever, the level file for my game Moose Solutions, it was really just it was just really simple thing. It was like, here's all the values in the tile map, and like here's all of the entities that are in this puzzle, and here's their location on the tile map, and here's where the switches are, and here's where the goalpost is, and here's where the player is going to start. It was only information related to my game, and I had complete control over that. So that's a huge perk, I think, to doing stuff from scratch. I have had to create some tools for editing levels and some other data that is too hard to describe in code, but I only had to do so out of necessity. Sometimes I even scrapped a tool I made when I realized I could describe the same stuff using code. My idea these days is this. I am a solo developer. I don't need to put stuff into friendly data formats or tools unless the tool really aids my creation process. Put as much in the code as possible. A procedure with some parameters for creating certain types of game objects is often better than an editor. I 100% agree with this. And so a little bit of background on what I did with Moose Solutions, okay? I did end up creating a level editor, but that level editor was really only something that I knew how to use, okay? So I had some only really basic usability in that level editor. I had the ability to put down trees and the moose and the player character and various like gameplay related entities in the game. And you could save files, you could load levels. But it was not an intuitive editor to use. Which is to say that I couldn't just go and take that editor and give it to like a friend to make levels in the game, right? Because there's just a bunch of stuff in there where you would just kind of have to know what the keys are or what the rules are, or, for example, like doing the edges around the level, like those were just like special tiles. And so you would have had to know that. And I guess what I'm trying to communicate with you is, there's a big difference in the amount of effort that you have to put in to say just doing it in the code, that's the lowest amount of effort, right? No editor, no tool, nothing needed. Just do it in the code. If you can get away with that, that's great. A level up from that is making a tool that only you yourself understand, right? So like I would call that the level editor with really crappy UX, right? And that is actually like an acceptable thing to do. You can totally make a level editor with crappy UX that only you understand, right? Because you're not going to share, because you're only using it to do your game, right? And then maybe later, okay. Now the third tier of it, like the most effort, would be making a generic tool that could be used to make any level in any game, right? That's like, if we're talking about a curve of like exponentially like difficult, like that like generic tool is so much harder to do than just a quick crappy tool with bad UX that only you, the programmer, understand, right? So very, very good thing to call out. If you work on a team, you must make sure to provide tools to empower the team. But for a solo developer, creating tools that you actually don't need might just have the opposite effect. Yep, you're creating crazy amounts of work for yourself at a time when you really shouldn't be doing that. At a time when you really should just be getting straight to the point of what the game is, right? So again, comparing my 35-year-old self to my 19-year-old self, I found an advantage to using Odin over C++. My C++ projects usually didn't leave the prototype stage. Perhaps it was due to inexperience, but also there is a certain feeling of dread sometimes when you have a big C++ code base and want to implement a new mechanic, because C++ is a bit too chatty. There is just slightly too much friction in C++. In Odin, the code is both more compact and simpler, making it possible for me to, just barely, clear the mental hill of having to add new features when I need to. Yeah, I mean, so there's parts that I agree with here, and maybe parts that I guess what I would say is I have a little bit of a different experience with C++. First of all, I'm just going to say right out the gate, C++ is a horrible programming language. What I mean by that is, if you were trying to actually use all of the features that they advertise in C++, which is enormous and keeps changing and they keep adding more to it, you would not get any work done, right? And mostly like you just wouldn't even really be able to understand. I'm serious, just like go try and read the C++ documentation. It's abysmal. It is, Jonathan Blow at one point described it as a big pile of rubble. And I think that is the most accurate description of C++. They have all this crap, all these features, all this stuff that maybe this, Karl saying C++ is a bit too chatty. It's too charitable, man. Like, and I know maybe that's like something you want to do just to like avoid the controversy. But I'm going to say like C++ is horrible. It's a horrible programming language. It's really an awful direction for us to even be going in. So now to kind of like provide a little bit of a counter to that, because now I just told you C++ is horrible. What I would say is, if you use C++, if you use C++, but you pretend that you're writing mostly C code, you're just doing the C part and not the plus part, which, John Carmack describes this as C flavored C++, which is what I basically do. It's also what Casey Muratori does in Handmade Hero. I think it's manageable. I think it's manageable. It's not ideal, which is why we have people like Ginger Bill creating Odin. And it's also why Jonathan Blow is making Jai. right? Because we all recognize, I think those of us who are trying to put products in front of customers, we recognize that C++ is like the wrong thing for game development, but it's kind of all we have, or has been all we've had for a while. And so we've had to make these compromises, right? And one of the compromises is, well, we'll just forget about all this trash about like, move semantics and like constructors and destructors and RAII and template metaprogramming. Forget about all that. Just pretend you're dealing with C, and it's a mostly okay. It's okay. Like it's not great. Like we're not unlocking the potential of, future generations of programmers. Like we're not doing anything, awesome, but at least like we can get some work done, right? So I would look at it that way. Like there are ways to make C++. You can use it in a way where you can actually get some work done. So that's where I might disagree a little bit with this paragraph, but perhaps that's just my experience, since I did make my game engine with C flavored C++, very much in the style of Casey Muratori. Okay, so another comment. This could be a great segue back to Rust. It reminds me too much of C++ in the worst way possible. Right. The complexity, adding more and more on, more and more features on, more and more checks, more and more this, more and more that. And the more that you add that, you're creating this friction that stops people from just being able to get straight to the point of making the game, right? Just get to the gameplay. So that's sort of how I feel with like a lot of memory safety features. Is a lot of times, like, because I have some experience managing memory, with doing like arena-based allocation, static allocation, pointers, like, doesn't really scare me. Like I can make games that have pointers and I'm not flipping out about it. And I'm like, I have more experience now that I've done it. So, your mileage may vary, but I prefer to have the flexibility and the friction, the lowered friction of just using pointers. Okay. Also, Raylib is a bit simpler to use than SFML. All in all, it just felt fun to write games again, and I felt like I could get to writing gameplay very quickly and also have an easier overview of the project than if I use a big engine like Unity. Was working with creating game engines a mistake? No, I learned very good programming principles while professionally making game engines and game engine tools. The mistake was that I started to think that in order to make a game from scratch, you must first create a general purpose game engine. Yes, 100%. And that is the canonical error. If you can if you didn't hear me talking, or you weren't listening, or you're, often, daydreaming for this like whole thing, just take that away. Like when you're making games, you need to get straight to the gameplay. Forget about the engine. The engine is just whatever you need to do to make the gameplay work. That's it. So start with the gameplay code and then build out whatever supports that gameplay code, right? For me, the rule is make games, not general purpose game engines. And I actually have a video on that. It pretty much says the same thing. But I just thought there was a lot in this article that was really good, and I found that it kind of spoke to many of my different experiences. Again, I'm not a professional. Like I'm just a guy that like that was working in mobile apps and making games, and I suppose like maybe I could be perhaps a little bit more optimistic about my experience in doing mobile apps. It wasn't all bad. I think I did learn some good programming practices. It's just that I don't think that I got those practices from the people around me, actually. I had to, there is something to be said of, you have to get enough experience programming to be able to know what is good and what is bad, right? So if you are just a beginner and you are like just playing around with like object-oriented stuff, even though I think object-oriented programming is trash and I disagree with it strongly, and like I just think it's one of the worst things that ever happened to programming, You know, even getting experience programming with that kind of thing for a while, at least you got some experience and at least you learned a few different things, a few different techniques that hopefully might inform your perspective and make you come to appreciate better programming practices once you get that way. It's kind of like I was actually talking to my spouse about this. I was like, you know, to me it's kind of like this, like when somebody says that they really like object oriented programming or like some really like dogmatic form of functional programming. To me, it's kind of like them saying that they like Nickelback. It's kind of like, yeah, like I like the frat boy version of like alternative rock, and like it like strikes me as like you have no taste. But like you're in it, but you just don't have taste yet. And you can develop taste. Like, like at some point, maybe somebody will introduce you to like better music, right? Like some better bands, like, somebody will say, hey, you should try listening to Radiohead, or like, or try listening to this classical, try listening to Bach, try listening to, and then like, your mind, if your aim if your aim is to have taste in music or like to appreciate music, then when you are presented with what I consider the good stuff, the tasteful stuff, your mind will be blown, right? It'll be like, whoa, this is like so much better. And that was kind of my experience transitioning from object-oriented programming to just simple, straightforward procedural programming. I was like, whoa, okay, this is what the tasteful people do. This is so much better. It's so much more. There's so much more that I can do with it, and I just never went back. So it's kind of an experience like that. And then you kind of, like, I hate to say it, but it's not all bad, liking Nickelback, right? At least you like some music. At least you've listened to some music. It's not all bad. It's just you could have better taste and you could be doing better things with your life. That's all. That's all it is. So with that, I will stop and I will entertain questions. Yeah. Okay. So still patiently waiting for Jai .m. Um, yeah. Same. I'm not sure. Maybe the next game I prototype, I will try a different tool set. I did play around with Odin for a bit, and I actually greatly enjoyed it. Um, I think the only thing for me was I wanted perhaps more. At the time, I wanted more documentation on how to like use it with the debugger, so I kind of got stuck with that. But again, if I go and I read Odin's programming guide and having had conversations with Ginger Bill, um, his mind is in the right place and his heart is in the right place, and the aim of the project is genuinely doing something good. And we have people like Karl who have made some really great stuff with it. And so I would say Odin is very clearly a real contender in this. Um, and we don't really have Jai yet publicly, which is one of the downsides. It's like I would actually love to, I want to try it out. Maybe I'll get invited to the beta or something, but I can't really say much about it yet because I just honestly like haven't used it. But I mention it because I think John's heart also is in the right place, and I think he's got the right aim with that tool. So. Okay, well, this is fun. I will see you next time.